I'm Todd, and I was naughty. I did everything wrong. I got kicked out of art school, I drank heavily, and I looked to other religions and versions of spirituality to get fulfilled. The problem was, I was in the occult and I didn't even know it. My life was a wreck, and I had to learn what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus.
And I'm Laura. I was super nice. I did everything right. I got saved young, went to Moody Bible Institute, got married, and followed the Christian rules to having a good life. Problem was, that formula didn't work. I had to change how I related with Jesus.
At the end of the day, what I learned is the very simple truth. Jesus is the answer, and the only one that will ever actually fulfill you.
Naughty
versus
nice.
And welcome back to Naughty versus Nice. Of course, I'm Todd.
And I'm Laura.
Kelly.
And we are going to be talking more about the Trinity. We talked last week about the nature of the Trinity, how the Trinity kind of exists, and just some of the general kind of hitting the back to front and front to back on it. And we're going to go ahead and focus a little bit more on just some of the aspects of it. So specifically, the concept of the Father, the idea of that would be what most people would kind of understand from the Old Testament as being just like God, or God the Father, the one who talks, rider in the cloud, that kind of thing. Of course, obviously, like we covered last week, we do have the Father, we have the Son, and we have the Holy Spirit. But this week, we're mostly just going to spend focused on the Father and how that the Father shows up in the Trinity in a way that we can understand who he is and how he is not only separate of himself, but also, I don't know. I feel like, Laura, you're going to have to take it away on this one because I'm already having a hard time with it. You know,
There was a really great quote in this book where he said, you go to, and I think he was quoting someone in church history, you go to look at one person of the Trinity, and then all of a sudden you realize you can't apart from seeing all three. And then there's other times you're contemplating all three and you see them in distinction, but you can't separate them. And so I was having that difficulty this week thinking, well, God the Father is probably the more prolific image that we get from all of Scripture. It's what everybody identifies with. And I was still going a little bit, because in my mind, we understand so much of who he is through the expression of Christ. And through their relationship and how that was revealed. And so I kept coming back to that. And I was like, well, maybe we should wait until it's the Jesus week to do that one. So yeah, it was a problem. It was definitely a problem.
well, and that's just it, is that whether we realize it or not, the idea of the Father, even for most modern Christians, it really does come from these other place concepts that are just not Christian in general. I'll give you an idea. You can't help but look at the Sistine Chapel and Michelangelo's depiction of this gray-haired, gray-bearded, wise old figure reaching out in order to bestow the gift of life to man, when he touches him on the finger, and all the different funny parodies, whether it's hot dog vendors or whatever you got on the internet of those kind of things. But it's in my head, whether I realize it or not, that's how I'm always kind of picturing him. I'm picturing him as this physical figure. But yet, when you really do look at the Trinity, God the Father is not physical. It really is more Jesus takes on those physical qualities, the physical characteristics. Obviously, the Spirit kind of speaks for itself. And the Father kind of becomes this nebulous, amorphous, I don't know what to do with him in my head sometimes. So, why don't we kind of jump in with maybe the first thing you want to hit, or the first aspect, character, or quality, or the first key point you want to make?
Well, it kind of struck me again, this in studying this, we understand and we look at God and we say, oh, God the Father, and then we think of it as a role, but it isn't a role. It is his identity. As much as Christ is the Son, God is the Father. And so that isn't just something like, well, he acts like one. No, in essence, it is what he is. I had a quote, God's revelation as the Father does not refer to general fatherhood of all creatures. Moreover, as Toon, which is referring to a theologian, comments, the name Father is not merely a simile, as if God were simply like a father, or even a metaphor, an unusual use of language drawing attention to aspects of God's nature in a surprising and odd term. But it is a definite personal name. Father is the proper name for God and does not merely describe what he is like. And I thought it's an interesting bookmark in your thinking, because we don't think that. We just think he's God, and he's kind of the head of the Trinity, and he does important things, and he's the Father. But no, that's his baseline definition. It's who he is. Does that seem like a different thought to you at all? Or
It does, and it's strange to me because there's part of it where I think of the idea of the Father and the Son, and then I immediately jump to, well, obviously the Father existed first, and then obviously he somehow created or begat the Son, because obviously that's what begat means, because the Old Testament says that, until you actually look into what the word begat means, and it's like, okay, that's not what it means. So, but they have these roles, and those roles operate. I mean, the language is specific. The language is intentional. So they operate within these roles as the Father and Son and the Spirit, but they also don't, but they also do. But I don't, that's the part that gets confusing on some of this stuff, because it's easy, and I get how people get to the idea of well, Jesus is the Son. He's a created being. He's something like that. And the Father is the ultimate source, because when we think of God, we default to the concept of the Father, so to speak. But that's not quite right, because we should be defaulting to all three of them existing, to use the analogy I used last week, that chord. It's not the separate note, but it's the chord. The chord is God, or all three notes playing at the same exact time. The Father is just one of those notes that equals the chord, but he's also the chord too, kind of. I don't know. I have a hard time with it. Jesus, for whatever reason, I can kind of grab onto a little bit more. You know what I mean? Because he's walking around probably cracking some jokes, eating fish, and telling his disciples, go ahead, pull my finger. That's something I can kind of, for lack of a better way to put it, there's a tangible quality to his existence that I can relate to, associate with, or something. And for some reason, the Spirit, I don't have too much of a problem with, but it's the concept of the Father. It just gets very mixed up.
Well, and another thing I think needs to be kind of just slid into a more correct angle is he is to be understood as the Father to the Son, not necessarily the Father of all creation. I'm not saying that theme can't be there, but that isn't the defining principle of who he is, because creation comes out of the reality of who he is. So who he is can only be, in its purest reality, who he is within that Trinitarian relationship. And so to understand him as Father is to understand him as Father to Christ, who obviously pre-incarnate is not Jesus the man, but the pre-incarnate Son. That is the lens in which we have to understand him through. Does that alter it a little bit?
No,
more?
yeah, it does. But that's just it, though, is I think that the main thing, the impression that I seem to be getting, I think we touched on it a little bit last week, is the idea that the Father is sort of like I almost said Genesis, the initiator of action, the initiator of thought, the initiator of movement. And then you have the Son, who is sort of like the activator, or the action mechanism by which that will, or by which that desire, or by which that initial push becomes manifest. And then you kind of have the Spirit like encouraging, holding it together, or something along those lines. It's kind of the way that I think of it now, or at least I'm trying to. And once again, maybe you can point out, you're very good at 2 or 3 steps out from something like this, and it falls apart. But that's kind of how I'm trying to think of it right now. So yes, I'm aware that Father and Son, and that language is intentional. There is a relationship there that is specific, but it's not human. But the language matters. And that's one of the areas, like I said, where I still get kind of stuck up, or I still hit those speed bumps, and I'm just not sure what to make of it.
I did come up, and I went to make a drawing so I could hold it up and seem really impressive, because you're the creative one, you'd be impressed. But the idea, last week we talked about the Father as being causal, and then the Spirit or the Son as the expression of that initiating cause, and then the Spirit being the movement in acting what Christ had done. And so in my head, I'd made, you've got God, and I just drew him as a circle, because in Greek, circle line through is God. So you've got God, the Father, and then I was going to put a megaphone, because that's what I picture is, as he speaks, Christ becomes that venue for what happens then. And so he's the expression. He magnifies the initial idea, quote, of God's. And then the Spirit was going to be a tornado.
Right.
So you've got the circle,
yeah.
a megaphone, and the tornado. And because as you look through the themes and you start putting it through that grid, they tend to operate in those roles together. And so you do have this initiating. So people are uncomfortable saying God the Father is the originator or the initiator, because it implies hierarchy. But I think that, I wrote something. Let's see what I wrote. This is just me with my notes. When people hear the Father spoken of as the origin or initiator within the Trinity, there's an understandable response of, no, he shouldn't be called this because it implies he has precedence or higher status. But if we understand him to be initiator, then it also is true that all that has come to be in Christ, in the Spirit, and in the new kingdom of the gospel, all of that has behind it this driving, never-ending, unwavering, passionate motivation of the Father. So my mind then was drawn to 1 John, behold what manner of love the Father has given unto us, that we should be called the sons of God. Because if Father is only to be understood as Father to Christ as his Son, when we are engrafted into Christ, now we experience the fatherhood of God as Christ does. It's different than just he created us and he's the father of creation, those ideas. It's much more intimate. And so if we can't separate them out, because yes, we see him in Jesus, but we see this driving passion of the purpose of God. So he is the originator, but it isn't like nobody else had any idea and they're subservient to him. It is their delight to fulfill his idea. I think that's the way I kind of see it.
That makes sense to me, because one of the key points that I wanted to touch on, and something, if you go way back to some early episodes that we did, where I talked about the nature of the Luciferian doctrine and why this ties in and why this matters. I think that I wrote down here, many Christians unknowingly align with the occult interpretation or the occult idea of who God the Father is, meaning that it's this angry Old Testament, bring in the wrath, kill the women and children, salt the earth, let's get this done and burn everything kind of thing. And you can't do enough good and kill enough animals and soak yourself in enough blood in order to appease me. You know, it's this kind of concept. And a lot of times we have it because of just the way that ancient Israel is kind of showing up in the world, kicking out the Canaanites, you know, and taking over the land and taking possession of it. And by God's rightful decree, by the way. But the idea of sacrifice, the idea of cutting everything in half, the idea of being up to your elbows in animal blood in order to atone for sin. Symbolically, that makes sense until you start looking at the pragmatic way in which that gets acted out in the world. It's a horror show. You know, it's like one of those Saw movies or something like that. So a lot of times I think Christians will inadvertently kind of start adopting this occult idea, this occult mindset where this God is this wrathful, angry, dangerous creature that we have to appease. You can't sacrifice enough good stuff in order to get in his good graces. And we kind of act that way, whether we know it or not.
And I find it interesting because I think there's a lack of education and understanding of the Old Testament, because over and over through the week, and I didn't know why, and maybe this is why, I kept thinking we see God the Father in the Abrahamic covenant and in the act of it. So you have Abraham being put to sleep and experiencing like this darkness, and he had separated the animals, but God himself takes on the weight of the covenant for both parties and walks between the torn animals, saying, if this covenant not be kept by both parties, then this shall be done to me. And so if you know what you're looking at, you know you're already seeing Christ, because that is the passionate beginning of a promise that says you won't be able to do it, and I will come and I will be torn asunder in order that this covenant can be kept. That isn't an angry, wrathful God, but it is a God coming through with this weird fire lantern, and there's darkness and there's animals strewn everywhere. But if you know what you're looking at, it's being spoken to a culture that would have seen that completely differently than we do. It would be reverence more than fear.
Well, and that's a lot of it, and which is one of the reasons we've talked about the nature of shadows and types, and we see this foreshadowing or this, there's a term. What's that term that you use? Not shadows and types, but
prefigurement?
Yes, the prefigurement term. And we see that in these places where it seems the most unlikely, but that does make sense. God's the only one perfect enough in order to be able to fulfill any kind of covenant that he actually does make. Humans are always going to fall short. He shows up that way in pretty much the very first one, give or take Eden, okay? But you know, by fulfilling absolutely everything and then or setting it all in motion and then being the complete fulfillment of that through Christ in his ultimate sacrifice and resurrection that we do see, you know, into the New Testament. So there's a part of it where it's like this poetic beauty where, of course, that would be how God shows up. But we still can see this specter of, you know, frowning, you know, that kind of thing, you know, popping up in the Old Testament. You know, I have a quote, and I just want to do a quick reminder here. So with the Luciferian doctrine, and for somebody who doesn't know what I'm talking about or hasn't heard that episode, they're like, why is this guy talking about this? Luciferian doctrine is something, it's not, if you type that into Google, you're probably not going to come up with it. But for my purposes of trying to explain some of these occult concepts and what they believe or what the occult believes, and there's no one thing called the occult. It's an umbrella term in order to describe a lot of different concepts, ideas, religions, organizations, however you want to call it. But it can kind of be broken down into just the simple 5 steps. You got the first idea, which is God and Lucifer are equals. Then the next one would be that Adam and Eve were held prisoner in the Garden of Eden. And the next one would be Lucifer saw that this was unjust, so he set mankind free from a jealous and vindictive God. And then Lucifer gave mankind the gift of knowledge and enlightenment. And that's obviously through the tree. And then, of course, it's through this enlightenment that Adam and Eve would go on to conquer the natural world and to, in turn, become as God is. So these are the 5 main planks of it, or the 5 general concepts. And why I bring this up is, let's take a listen, or I'll read a quote from a very, very popular atheist. This is Richard Dawkins, and he wrote this book called The God Delusion. Many people probably are familiar with it. And the quote goes, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser. A misogynistic, homophobic, racist. An infinite... word I can't pronounce because I went to public school. Genocidal. More words I can't pronounce. I probably should have read this through before going and recording. Megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, and capriciously malevolent bully." That's an atheist talking. And all of a sudden you go, that's interesting, because the atheist has the identical worldview of God that the Luciferian does. And they swear up and down, but I'm not religious. I'm not religious. I don't want to have anything. I don't believe in any God. I don't believe in anything. Wow, what a coincidence, because you can still be a Luciferian and not believe in a quote-unquote God. My point with this, is that when we accidentally, inadvertently, without realizing it, the Christian with the best of intentions and the desire to have that fullness of relationship with God inadvertently sees some of the things going on in the Old Testament, and we kind of start judging God in our own mind. Well, maybe some of the atheists are right. Maybe some people, he is kind of vindictive. He is kind of a jerk. He is kind of this. Stop yourself. You're seeing it wrong. You're all of a sudden, whether you realize or not, you are looking through an occult lens, and they've worked very, very hard in order to instill this in us through whether it's atheism and the culture of that, whether it's movies, media, entertainment, and music, so that we come up with this idea on our own as though it's our own idea, when clearly it's not. I mean, whether it's Richard Dawkins carrying it, any other atheist, or just the Luciferian doctrine or the concept of that itself, it's not originating, so to speak, from within us. It's something that we're given, and that lens starts showing up in the way that we maybe conduct a Bible study or something. It's a long-winded kind of way of saying it. This stuff matters. How we view the Father, it matters.
I remember the first time when we went through the presentation, or you went through the presentation, and I sat there and I thought, I never heard any of this stuff. I don't spend any time really in the company of material or people who are trying to convince me that Satan is actually Jesus. And so it's like, what? I think I went through 4 times. I think 4. And there were still times I was like, what did he just say? But it is there. That's what is interesting that is in some of the results of people commenting on even the last episode. There was some commentary that alluded to that. And I was like, oh, there actually are people out there who believe that stuff. So it is relevant, and it matters to have both grids, the naughty and the nice. If you can have a great deal of scriptural foundation, and you'll be able to see the problem, but you won't be able to see the mechanization of the problem. And I think that's important on both sides. So I think it is imperative to it's important to listen to you, is what I'm saying.
It's one of those things. Look, I can appreciate the idea of not wanting to focus on it. What are the side effects of people like me that were involved in the occult, realize it, figured it out, don't want to have anything to do with it? We tend to see Satan in everything. We tend to want to warn everybody all the time as though that's the only thing that matters. It matters. It's not the only thing, obviously. And so, which is why we do the show and why we talk about the subjects that we do. I don't know what the proper proportion is for something, but when it comes to this and when it comes to the idea of the Father, look, let me kind of take another jump here. So just kind of you see what it is that I'm talking about. When you have this idea of what Dawkins when you look at a large body of work, the atheists or the four horsemen of the apocalypse, they were called, it's like Sam somebody, Dawkins, a few other guys, they all were British or whatever, like 10 years ago or so. And I started seeing them, they were popping up on my radar, and I was going, okay, I recognize a lot of the things that they were saying, but it wasn't in a way that I understood it. And I'll give you an example. So they were saying God was a jealous tyrant. God was evil. God was vindictive. I'm like, I know exactly what that is, and I know where that is. They were saying that they don't say we love Lucifer, but over the course of listening to their argumentation, you'd see they'd say, we need freedom, we need morality, we need truth. These are the principles of what it means to be human. These are enlightenment principles. So these were the goals and the aspirations by which to build a foundation of proper, healthy human society. It would come through scientific understanding. It would come through human reason. It wouldn't come through divine revelation. See, it would be man-centered, man concept, and expressed through the world through the achievements of man and how man understood things. And it's like, it's not as obvious, but you're seeing the fruit of the tree in that. It's through the enlightenment idea. See, the tree was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It wasn't just they could tell the difference now. There's a symbolic aspect to it where now Adam and Eve were getting their knowledge and information not from God. They were getting it from themselves, from the tree, from the fruit, from the snake, however you want to look at it, from enlightenment principles. And then what you end up coming to is the idea that Dawkins would suggest over and over again, if not say outright directly, that he viewed Christianity, he would always couch it in religion, but he never really went after the Muslims. You know what I mean? So it was always kind of Christianity as a form of like mental slavery, the idea that this is something to openly and proudly reject or rebel against. So what do you ultimately have? You have the Luciferian doctrine in atheism, and it shows up in the contempt for the Father, specifically the Old Testament scriptures, in the idea that God is evil and bad. We need to rebel against him, and we need to be the center of our own enlightenment and our own understanding and be the truest expression of who man is, taking that forbidden fruit, conquering nature, and becoming as God is. Most Christians miss this entirely. They just don't see it. So, like I say, the idea that atheism is not a religion is ridiculous. It is. It's Luciferianism, just with different branding.
And even when, we consider the paganism of old, back in the day, they had, idols and things that they built with their own hands. There was a participation of themselves with the act of their worship. And in a sense, they had to be a participant in a way in which they could achieve something. I just find it very interesting because I've always just seen that as that's the way of man. I will find a way to earn it, to achieve it, to brag about it, to win it, to earn it. And when you strip the gospel down in front of someone and you say, you cannot do a single thing, ever, anything. And you can't, to get saved and to grow, you can't do that. And they're like, well, no, I don't like that. I think that. So it's just interesting because I'm hitting my microphone. Sorry. Let's just get it out of the way. Okay. So it's because we used to have these conversations when you came over to hit my kids. Yes.
Gotta like throw the caveat on that. I taught them how to box. Okay. Right. I didn't just come over, roll up my sleeves, I taught them how to box.
It looked a little bit more like, okay, we're going to go get like mouth guards. And I was like, okay, this time only one of my children had been in really like dangerous, aggressive sports. And I was like, okay. And then you're like, and the first time you get hit really hard in the face as they have these guard things on, you're going to feel it. I'm going to ring your bell.
Absolutely.
And so I just decided then you guys did this in the garage. I just decided I'm not going to go out. I don't need to be a part of this. I know it's happening, but I don't need to watch it happen. So no, I never had to.
You don't want to watch one of your 14-year-old kids start graying out on the sides.
Oh,
you know what I mean?
You can tell enough with football.
He's not able to see what's going on anymore and not able. Yeah. But everybody needs it. I'm just saying, guys, if you have not been in a fight, you need to learn how to fight. Go get punched a bunch of times. You need to black out. You need to know what it's like when somebody hits you and you just fall asleep.
A lot of people were like, well, I don't think it's good to teach, especially my youngest, how to hit and stuff. But I thought if you could see the confidence that gives them because you take away the element of fear, they've been smashed.
Yeah.
So now they know what it feels like. Anyway, that's our sidebar.
Just like the ancient Israelis didn't have any fear when they went to war and started doing all the stuff the evil, vindictive God wanted them to do. That's a segue.
So you tried real hard there.
It didn't work. It didn't work.
My point was, we used to sit afterward. You would just say these things about the occult, and I would say these things theologically, and we would, for a long time, it was like, I don't know, talking towards the wall until it started to make sense to me that they both lined up and they verified and testified to one another. So I see it everywhere. And once you start looking for it, you do see it.
Yeah. Once I stop sounding like a crazy person and you understand,
Sorry,
I know it sounds weird to say, but like once you understand what I'm actually saying, because until you get the concept, until you understand the concepts of the Trinity, until you get what's going on, when people say the word Trinity, they're like, oh yeah, I totally understand what that means. No, you don't. You don't. I barely do. And it's the same kind of thing. It's like we take for granted. We think we understand that comic that I think I mentioned that one time before, that like old comic strip. It's like to name something creates the illusion in humans that we understand it. And then it's an arrow pointing to a drawing of a peach. Just because you call it a peach does not mean you understand what a peach is. And it's the same idea. Just because you're like, yes, I know what the occult is, I promise you don't, because it shows up in the weirdest places, in the weirdest ways. And it really is everything except for Christianity. I mean, it really is. In the same idea with talking about the idea of the Trinity. I know exactly what the Father is. I don't even know what the Father is. And I'm like, I'm doing a show where I'm intentionally talking about the concept like I know what I'm talking about. So let's defer it to you. I think you're just better educated on the subject than I am, or at least have a lot more time and experience with some deep thought regarding who the Father is. Why don't you take it away for a little bit? Just kind of go through the topics and the things and the key points that you think really resonate with you and are really going to resonate with somebody trying to be like, what is the Trinity? What is the Father? How does this all show up?
Well, I'm looking for the one thing, as always, the one thing that's not in front of me. John 12:44-45. There's two different places where he says something like this. And Jesus cried out and said, he who believes in me does not believe in me, but in him who sent me. He who sees me sees the one who sent me. And the other one is, often the quoted, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And it was within the last year, I heard it being preached on, and this was a big, eye-opener for me, that's always been said that, well, now you know what God looks like, in that he's loving and he's this and that. That's not wrong. And that's so much of what I think studying is that you find that your answer isn't really wrong. It's just very, very, very embryonic, if that's a word. And so a bigger expression of that was what I was hearing in this sermon was, when you see him, you see the culmination of the faithfulness and the promises and the endurance and all of that purpose of God. That moment that Christ is conceived and there is incarnation, there's reconciliation between deity and man. And that in itself, just that event by itself, is the pinnacle event of all of history. And we just don't get that. But to see this building force through the Old Testament of primarily what we would understand to be the Father, pushing and prophesying and promising and weaving and foretelling and prophesying and all the things he's doing, and to see it come into the moment where Christ comes and that union is created. So to see me is to see the Father, to see the conviction of the Father, to see the purpose and the drive towards redemption. He represents absolutely all of that. And then he dies and God raises him up by the Spirit. And there's that testimony of the whole Trinity of how incredibly pinnacle this event was. I don't know if that changes the passage at all for people, but there's a lot, even just if you just take time to meditate on that idea and you look to see what you see in Christ in the big picture, not just who he was and the things he said, but what he represents, you start to get a better picture of who the Father is.
It's the idea that once again, kind of jumping back a little bit to what I was talking about before, we'll have this idea, Christians do in general, that Jesus is the loving one. Jesus is the merciful one. Jesus is the loving expression. And in a weird sort of way, he saves us from the Father's wrath. But that's not correct, because Jesus and the Father are one. And kind of jumping into what you were talking about, Hebrews 1:3, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. Jesus is the representation of the Father as the Father shows up in the world, because the Father showed up in the world through Christ. Because there's, where is it? He says, whatever I do, my gosh, come on now. Whatever I do, it's because I'm doing the will of the Father. I don't do anything on my own accord. And so we kind of see that over and over again. And like you were talking about, it's not just this boiled down, put it on a greeting card kind of concept. There's this wider completeness. Once you throw in the idea that he did that first covenant and he carried out both parts himself, and then shows up, with Christ and doing the plan of salvation, that nexus point in history where absolutely everything meets together, it becomes complete, it becomes done, it becomes finished in this point, and then explodes out from there. And once again, we have more history and the tapestry in which God paints. And it's not necessarily revealing who he is and the majesty of who he is to us anymore, as much as pointing everything back to Christ so that we can see who he is. Whereas everything before was like revealing who he is, and then it shows up in that perfect expression of Christ. Everything points backwards and everything points forward at this nexus point in history of who Christ is.
And kind of speaking to the idea that God is the angry one, and the illustration was, you'll get to heaven and God will say, why should I let you in? And Jesus will say, and he's about to drop the hammer down and say, you got to get out of here, you're not worth it. And Jesus comes in the room like, no, remember, I died for him. So it's like, I don't know, I remember hearing that. I don't even think that made sense to me when I was first saved. I was like, oh, okay. But when you think about the Garden of Gethsemane, we know a few things later from what Paul writes, that when he says, for the joy set before him, Christ endured the cross. And so we understand there's something in that is his own view to the redemption of his bride. But in the ultimate sense, it is the love of the Father that commands Jesus to obey him. It's what brought him to that act of submission. It was the overwhelming clarity in the garden that this is the will of God, that you should drink this cup of wrath and take it upon yourself for our people. So there can't be a division of motivation there. Like Jesus is like, no, I'll do it. And God's like, you better, because I'm angry. It was always in Christ obeying. It's like he's operating in harmony in that Trinitarian relationship. He is in agreement with the whole purpose of the whole God. If that makes any sense.
No, it does, because
God sounds funny. I don't know.
But that's just it. It all was the plan since the foundation of the earth, since the writing of the names in the book of Lamb, however you want to work that out. But he still had to do it. And that's the other part, because it was still a real physical event and really took place in time, that really did happen, that it's not all symbolic. It's not all metaphorical. Because if it was, then it would fall apart and at a certain point have no meaning. It would be a great bunch of interesting stories, but it's not bound and rooted and grounded in anything real. When we have the real history, when we have the real event, when we have the real moment, we have the do or die moments where Christ is still human. I mean, he's 100% human, 100% God, however you want to break that down. He's still basically, sweating blood, having that one-on-one moment with the Father. And he's like, if there's any other way, can we please do it? Whatever that is. And no, there's no other way. We're following through. And he's like, okay, then let's do this. It's like you had said, it just shows the complete oneness of what's going on and what's happening. Yes, they're three separate parts. Was God the Father sitting there sweating blood too? I don't know, probably not. But in a weird sort of way, in perfect relationship with Christ and perfect relationship with the Spirit, they had to have been feeling something. They had to have been. So this weird kind of thing, because we've even talked about it before. When Christ is actually put up on the cross by the Father, and then Christ is the one carrying out the crucifixion of himself, and the Spirit's there encouraging him, there's a part of that that was delightful to do, not delightful in this cruel, malevolent, vindictive way that we talked about earlier, that somebody like Dawkins would bring up, but in the fact that it is the complete unity of all three together in the oneness and the truest expression of who God is as being that sacrificial lamb, the perfect oneness, in order to have his majesty and his glory revealed in this perfect plan of salvation.
And you'll see the repeated theme of, and that's why it makes no sense for the Father to be painted as this wrathful, evil person, because he is the causation. It originates, the idea is there, Christ takes on the flesh and brings it to expression, and then the Spirit takes that expression and moves it. And so there's just over and over, I mean, we saw it in creation, but you see it, some at the cross, it sounds a weird way to say that the Spirit's moving, but the Spirit is, Christ is Spirit DNA. And so he being there means the Spirit is there, but they do work in tandem to accomplish this. And it is called by Paul to be a pleasing fragrance unto the Father. And so the whole thing is just so tied together. And that would be, I guess, my challenge is, as I was doing this, I'm looking at different passages that were coming up for other reasons. And you don't really see how often, especially Paul is saying through God, by Christ, by the Spirit, he keeps using these same words, but they always ascribe a different movement to each one. Once you start looking for it, I think you'll start to appreciate it more. It's what befuddles me when people say there is no Trinity. Okay, tell that to Paul. You have to get rid of almost the whole New Testament, because that's all he's saying. He is the major author reworking the Jewish mindset of one God in order for it to be understood in this three-person aspect. He just didn't coin the term Trinity.
No, and it's like I was saying to somebody else earlier this week, the word Bible's not in the Bible. I guess the Bible's invalid now. The gravity's not in the Bible. What was Jesus being held up on the cross from? It's kind of like, okay, look, I can appreciate wanting to be authentic and accurate and understand the truth and want to be respectful and not go ascribing a single mono God to being three persons. That would be offensive if that was the true expression of who he was. But just because the word Trinity is not in the Bible doesn't mean that the Trinity is not there and that it's not relevant or it's not obvious. There are any number of different things that you can use to say that word's not in the Bible. And it's also funny to me, by the way, you'll get people that will do apologetics in a lot of cases. They'll use the exact same argument. Just because the word science isn't in the Bible doesn't mean the Bible doesn't have science in it. Whether it's the length, width, and height of the ark itself and how it was actually built. What was it? Length is 3 times the width or something, which is the most stable boat you can possibly build when it comes to something being in the water. Thousands of years before anybody put pen to paper and actually figured that all out, Noah was rocking it out, way ahead of time. You can say there's no science in the Bible. The word's not in there. But it's clearly shown, clearly displayed through the way, just the description of the ark itself and using the measurements that are there. Similarly, we get the same kind of concept with the Trinity itself, whether it's Paul talking about it, all of them being there at the crucifixion, all of them being there at the baptism, however you want to put it, they're all there. They're all showing up. And Paul does an excellent job of laying it all out as far as how their relationship shows up in relationship to one another.
And I think you've pointed it out too before with Paul being such a devout, educated, scholarly Jew, and then to be saved and have that altering experience and then to be writing something that is so incredibly contrary to what he would have held to passionately just 3 years before, or however, I guess it's 14 years before I think he starts writing. But needless to say, it testifies to the reality of it because he is basically undoing his own thought, if that makes any sense.
He's undoing who he is. Look, you ask somebody, even today, what they do, and they'll tell you they're an accountant. Their identity of who they are is kind of wrapped up in the idea of being an accountant. They'll make accountant jokes, or they're not making truck driver jokes. You know what I mean? Like, because they're not a truck driver. That's not part of their identity. It's not part of who they are and how they do things. The same kind of thing going on with Paul, and I don't know. I actually, the whole point that I had just jumped out of my head. It just left. I was going to make a good one, I swear.
I was like, truck driver. Okay,
I started getting wrapped up. I started thinking about episodes of BJ and the Bear when I was a kid. And then I started thinking about Clint Eastwood, and he had a chimpanzee in that one movie where he like fought dudes in a train yard. And then it made me think of punching your kids. And that was just the whole thing. It's just all.
Now, BJ and his best friend Bear, I have just a side story.
Right?
I don't know that my dad will ever listen to this, but I think my brother and we were very small, and we were playing on our tricycles in the basement, and we decided we'd play mailman, and we would take my dad's bills and rip them up, and that would be our mail. And I don't know if we were told not to or not, but we both got in trouble. And I remember that I think that was the time that you could either get a spanking or you could miss BJ and his best friend Bear and the Incredible Hulk. And I didn't want to miss them. So I took the brutal end. And then later I was like, why was I dumb? Because my brother was much smarter. He was like, yeah, I'll miss the show. It'll be on next, summer. So anyway, anytime I hear BJ and his best friend Bear, I think of that very traumatic, scarring incident in my life.
Part of me that's really, really glad they have not brought that one back and like done a movie on it or anything like that. Maybe I should write that one. That'd be fun, BJ the Bear, his best friend's a monkey.
I don't even remember much except for that part. But anyway, you're welcome for that story.
Yeah.
There you
Let's
go.
get back on track.
Right. Kelly's like, why are they talking about monkeys and truck drivers? So, okay, so getting back to this idea, I have written down here, look, the Father isn't reluctantly accepting you because Jesus convinced him to. Kind of what we were talking about before. The idea of, no, he's with me. Don't kick him out. The Father himself sent the Son, Jesus, into the world to bring you back home to him. He's not a king on a throne kind of giggling with delight so that he can't wait to cast, the human into the fiery pit. He's a deeply personal God that has created everything so that you could know him, so that you could accept the invitation into his kingdom, and so that you could be with him forever. And I think one of the best examples that we can have of this, oddly enough, is the parable of the prodigal son. And in that parable, most people kind of know it. This is Luke 15:11-32. The general gist of it, you got a guy who's really, really wealthy. The father, he's the landowner. He's got two kids. One's the good kid that stays at home and works on his property and all that kind of stuff. The other one is kind of a spoiled jerk. And he's like, no, Dad, I want my inheritance now. And then he goes and the father's like, okay, you can have it. And then he runs off and he gets into the nightlife and he goes to all the clubs. He's making it rain, yo, or whatever the ancient equivalent is of that. They probably didn't have penicillin back then, if you know what I'm talking about. So anyways, he ends up poor and penniless in like a pig house or a pigsty, literally. And then he ends up crawling back home, or at least his head held or hung in shame. And the father ends up seeing him, and the son's walking back, and the father jumps out in excitement, runs out to him, hugs him, kisses him. He's so happy his son has returned, and he tells his servants to go kill the best, not hog because he was in the pigsty, whatever, the best cow I got. We're having steaks, yo. Let's get some ribeyes on the grill. And so everything's medium rare. Everybody's happy, except for the first son, who is the quote-unquote good boy, who's like, I don't get it. I stayed and did all the good stuff. I did everything right. And here you are celebrating him. He's like, no, man, you don't get it. He's home. He's where he belongs. That's the Father. That's who it is. That's how a way to think of who the Father is and the character and the personality, at least a way that I can think of it to understand it. I might not understand the relationship with the Father and the Son and the terms and how it all shows up, but I can get this. I can understand this idea of someone that's so loving, so caring, and just the ultimate expression of who he is as he shows up in the world is Christ. There isn't any length he's not going to go to in order to bring about the proper completeness and the restoration and what's the other R word? I always think it's restoration, but it's not. Redemption. Thank you. I don't know why. I got to take my ADHD brain meds better, more of them today or whatever. Yes. I just forgot the word again. Are you kidding me?
Redemption.
Yes, thank you. Holy smokes. Now I'm thinking
we could be on that pyramid show.
I know. I should exactly. I should write it down. It's that redemption. That's the point. That's what's going on. That's the culmination and the completeness of absolutely all this is, and the maximum true expression of who God is, especially through the Father, which is that first causal mover, so to speak.
And it's not a strange concept because Tim Keller's book, Prodigal God, was so very popular. But I remember just being blown away that he looks at both of the sons, because the oldest son is my personality. It's my kind of belief where you do well and you do good, and then you are almost transactionally expecting some reward. And so that son had been faithful, had stayed, had suffered the loss of his inheritance because it was, taken early by the other one. And he's angry when the other one returns because he thinks he deserves more. And so I always tell people, if you don't think you are going to believe that about God, wait till he takes something away or doesn't give you something you probably think you deserve. And then you'll know just how much you were doing it for that reason. But interestingly enough, the father's response to that son is equally kind and hope as it is to the other. And so, because the son, he wants him to celebrate with them, and he wants them him to see it from that side. And that's not just, I think that was taught to me as like, oh, we should, rejoice when a really sinful person comes back. No, it's the law keeper, the morality loving person. That's who the older son is. And so it's just interesting because the father doesn't change in what he's demonstrating. We just see what kind of people exist, I guess.
Yeah, how we show up in the world kind of shows up in one of the two personalities. To kind of hit on, I know, Kelly, I think you want to jump in real quick?
Do I?
Oh, I'm sorry. It looked like you had something you wanted to jump in on. Kelly and I went to this answer, which kind of sparked the whole episode that we had with...
Once saved, always saved?
Correct. And one of the people that was in there, it was talking about the idea of whether you could lose salvation or not. We probably touched on it in the episode, but it was something to the effect of, it's not fair. A sinful person can go out and do all the drugs and do all the partying and do whatever they want and then still end up saved in the end, while I'm living this pious, wholesome life the entire time. And of course, you see the connection, obviously, with the prodigal son and the mentality and the thinking behind it. But they were literally like, it's not fair, or as though, I don't think you when you read the scripture about the prodigal son, I don't think anybody's like, yeah, like he had a great, like, everybody's like, no, what are you doing? Stop it. Why? You're hurting everybody, hurting yourself. Knock it off, But yet we still, whether we realize it or not, have this kind of attitude of it. You mean I could be worldly and I can hug and kiss as many people as I want to without the intention of marrying them, and I can go and do this and do that and find out what cocaine smells like, and I don't, and it's possible for me not to suffer any ill consequences? Yeah, except for all of the ill consequences that go along with living that lifestyle.
It's a lie that the church has kind of perpetuated by accident, that somehow being joined to Christ, having this new life, being a part of this new kingdom, isn't in itself the best option. They think, oh, well, I'm giving up, I'm living this pious life. It shows a great ignorance of what we have in Christ. Because once you understand that, you would never want, even if you had no consequences to the party life, you know that life. And you don't. That's why Paul says, you know who you were. You don't want to go back to that. You want to remember who you are. We act like we haven't been given the best present on Christmas, and we have. And I'm not making a reference to Jesus's birth at Christmas. I'm just saying people act like they want to have the other life, but get the reward at the end. It's that the end life focus. It's seeped in, and that's what I think that it really, really bothers me.
Well, and that's,
I don't know if I seem ranty, but I'm ranty.
Well, normally I'm like the grouchy one, Well, that's the irony. That's the irony, though, is that everybody's like, oh, living a Christian life is terrible. It's like, no, the goal is to live the most maximum expression of how we're living today. That's what being in eternity is. It is this is like a shadow and type of what that life will be like. Everybody wants that one, but they don't want this one. Like, that doesn't even make any sense. They're like, no. Why can't I have the drugs and prostitutes and venereal disease? That's okay. They're not jiving up. They're not like this.
And even if I could pursue every worldly thing, whatever that looked like, without any venereal diseases, without any consequences, I would end up still lost, seeking, in the dark, grasping for something and always never finding it. That's what I don't think Christians don't understand, that because they're not living in the light of who they are. And so they're not finding their soul's satisfaction in relationship with him, because they don't understand the relationship they've been purchased for. End point. Kelly looked like I was yelling at her.
Father is the prodigal, I guess the prodigal son's father, or the father in the story of the prodigal son. This is the Father. This is the true expression of God. This is who Christ came to reveal to us. He's not the jealous super jerk of the Old Testament, and he's not this angry God that needs to be placated. He's not this occult-like figure. Whether we realize it or not, it is an occult view of who God is. It's not any of those things. This is the one who sent the Son for us to be the perfect sacrifice, to make good on that original covenant, and to be the bookends for humanity within that, our imperfectness, but bookended in his perfect completeness, if that tracks with kind of what I'm saying. I think this kind of all gets wrapped up within just the very, very simple verse that I think just about everybody knows. John 3:16. For God, and that would be obviously the Yahweh God, all three of them together, but seen as kind of the Father, so to speak, at least through this lens. So, for God, the Father, so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. That's who the Father is. That's who God is. That's how he shows up in the world, has chosen to show up in the world, and how he reveals who he is, the characters and quality of who he is in Scripture, so that we might know him, that we can have that relationship with him, and we don't end up going, what? You mean I could have been, hugging and kissing women I didn't plan on marrying and doing drugs this whole time? Why do I got to be a goody two-shoes? So we're not going to be that, the one of the two sons in the prodigal son story.
I'm obviously the eldest child in that story.
I'm clearly the one that ended up waking up face down in a pigsty a number of times. So I'm trying to segue that one. I can't. I'm not wearing or saying something I don't want to say. I'm trying to figure out how to segue that. So when it comes to the idea of who the Father is, at least within the Trinity itself, and some new ideas kind of open up to you, or maybe you got a favorite piece of Scripture you think really kind of captures the essence and the character of who the Father is, feel free to reach out to Kelly, Laura, or myself at Naughty Versus Nice. That's VERSUS nice at gmail.com. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll talk at you next time. I almost finger gunned it. Just saying.
That's
pew, 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 pew.
Please.
We'll talk at you next time. Pew, 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 pew. Hey, thanks for listening to Naughty Versus Nice. If this episode hit home for you, or, got us stepped on your toes a little, but in a good way, go ahead and follow, and leave us a review. It helps us out way more than you could possibly know. We're on all the socials at Naughty Versus Nice. That's VERSUS Nice. And if you believe in what it is that Laura and I are doing, you can definitely pop on over to patreon.com/Naughty Versus Nice and give us a hand there as well. Thanks for walking this road with us as we have these conversations, talk about these wider concepts, and discuss what it means to be followers of Christ. We really appreciate you joining us, and we'll talk at you next time.